And hopefully we'll be able to get a lot of the information out and some questions to you all. All right, so the 3 services that were talked about earlier about employment services on the waiver are employment development services, employment exploration services, and employment support services. Those are 3 separate services that have unique HCPC codes. I mean, they talked about some of those being changed and modified as we move forward. All 3 of those services require that the provider holds a 245D license, and the license is for those employment services, and it falls under the category of intensive support services. And then you also need to enroll as a Minnesota Healthcare Program enrolled provider. So they're 2 separate processes. Obtaining the 245D license is one process and what you start with, and then going through the enrollment process. If you're not already enrolled for other services that you might be offering, you go through that separately after you've obtained the 245D license. So the process, DHS has a great website on 245D licensing, and that hyperlink is right there on the bottom of that screen, and you can click on that link and it will bring you to that website that talks about applying for a license. And that is what a resource that you can do to offer 245D services. And we'll kind of talk about some of the requirements and things that you need for that license. So the first thing that you want to gather for a 245D license is a pre-application worksheet. And worksheet, it's actually 16 pages long, so it's not a one-pager, but it is information that you're going to need to gather and pull together to be able to apply for that license. There's information that's going to be needed about your agency, such as your organizational chart, and that information you want to include the highest level of authority in the company, who the controlling individuals are in the agency, the designated coordinator and designated manager for the agency, and we'll talk about what those positions are and what those responsibilities are. In that, you're also submitting 245D policies that meet the 245D, and I use this term 245D, that's actually Minnesota statutes, chapter 245D. That's the legislative language that you want to look at to read, to know about what is required. And that is the license that you hold, is that Cdcs 245D license. Let's see, so your policies and procedures that are required for that, you also want to include, make sure that they meet the definitions and the requirements of 245D. So your agency might already have policies and procedures on drug and alcohol use, or service termination, or grievances, things like that. So if you have those things in place, you'd want to compare them to what 245D requires and beef those up to make sure that they meet the standards. DHS has a list, and in that worksheet, it has a link to some sample policies and procedures that you can use or modify to meet your agency's needs. So that's a great resource for providers as well. So in addition to policies and procedures, you also want information on, again, all those different people in your organization. So controlling individuals, those are the owners or management or structure, or your officers within your organization, knowing who has control of the organization and has that decision-making authority. Also including some management level folks as well are listed depending on their level of authority. Once you've kind of gathered all these pieces together, policies and procedures, organizational chart, or information about who's employed and involved in your organization, then you can submit that and schedule a pre-application interview with a 245D licensor. And there is a $500 application fee that's payable during that process. And then DHS, the licensing, has 90 days of working days to review your application and make a determination. Other pieces that need to be done is looking at the Cdcs waiver and alternative care program provider training 101 course. So getting an overview of what is waivered services, what is some of the funding around that, and your responsibilities as an organization that's now providing Medicaid services. And then background studies too, for controlling individuals, and then as is required as part of the application process. Also, eventually you'll be having background studies for all staff that have contact with vulnerable adults. So that's a high-level overview of the application process, what it looks like, what's required of you, the timeline and the cost. Some little bits of 245D is that if you're holding a 245D license, you need to be really well versed in what 245D says and know how to operate services within the requirements there. But then you also want to know other regulations, and we put a link of a number of different regulations that you also want to be very aware of. So 245A is the Human Services Licensing Act. 245C talks about background studies and those requirements. Already referenced 245D. Minnesota Rules 9544, that's around positive supports and the approach of how we support people with disabilities in a positive and hopefully very person-centered way. And then some of the other regulations, the Maltreatment of Minors Act language, Vulnerable Adult Act, data privacy, HCBS provider requirements, some of the information you have to gather and track for billing. Compliance officer information there as well, making sure to run services smoothly and correctly, and to make sure that there's no fraud occurring in the services, that either intentionally or unintentionally through service delivery. And then HIPAA, of course, is a federal standard around privacy and healthcare information. So those are some of the regulations. And as a license holder, you are expected to be familiar with and operate services within those requirements. So some things people a lot of times have questions about 245D services and the qualifications of staff. So there's two positions and they can be held by the same person. It depends on your company and the size of your company and your organizational structure. The first is the designated coordinator, and that is the person or people that are overseeing the services at the individual level. So for each person receiving services, that they're looking for that their quality, that the services are being coordinated in a great way and delivering what's needed. So to qualify as that person, and this doesn't necessarily need to be a direct care staff or the direct employment staff. This is maybe the supervisor or manager overseeing all those staff. There's 4 different ways to qualify. The first is having a 4-year degree, or maybe it took you 5 years, but a degree in human services and 1 full-time year of providing direct care to people with disabilities or people age 65 or older. And so that's 2,080 hours of that direct care. So maybe they've worked directly 1 full year, full-time. Maybe it's someone that worked part-time over the series of a number of years, but you can calculate and hit that 2,080 hour mark. The other option is for people that have a 2-year degree or an associate's degree, and then they have 2 years of full-time direct support for people with disabilities or people 65 years old and older. Then the third option is some people hold a diploma from an accredited post-secondary institution, and that kind of was the tech school. Some of them had a human services technician certificate or diploma that were being issued. This goes back a number of years, but people had, some people hold that, and having that certificate as well as, or that diploma, as well as 3 years of full-time work experience would help them qualify as a DC. And then the final option, people with 50 hours of education or training in the field. So it does not need to be college credit. It does not, post-secondary institution. It could just be 50 hours of training that they receive from their provider that they work for, the employer, in topics around, service delivery. So those 50 hours of training, and then you add on 4 years of full-time direct care experience, working with people, again, with disabilities or 65 years and older. So it's wonderful that there is a career path and ladder for people providing 245D licensed services, that they don't necessarily need to go through college, but that their experience and some of the training they've had counts towards that. So again, that's a designated coordinator. You need at least 1 person in the agency that fulfills that and that can oversee work. You might have many people that are supervising many employment staff that are helping people. It really depends on your company. And then the other part there, we talk about being competent to perform the required duties. So they should be familiar with 245D. They need to know how to complete paperwork. They need to know how to coordinate services. They need to know how to communicate well with guardians and case managers. So having all of those pieces in place for that designated coordinator.
Hi, Angie, this is Ryan. I just wanted to jump in. I've been answering a couple questions that have come up in the chat, but there was one that I thought might be, if you could address with the group, is the question is, does the education for numbers 2 and 3 here have to be in human services?
Oh, great. Thanks, Ryan, for the support and for the question. So for both the number 2 option of associate's degree, that needs to be in human services. That's correct. And human services is kind of broad. So I always use myself as an example. I have a biology degree, which does not sound human services at all, but because I was focused in possibly going into medicine, most of my classes, if you looked on my transcript, included psychology and human development and anatomy and all those pieces. And it wasn't heavily filled with classes around plant physiology or agriculture or some of those other things that you might see with a biology degree. So really it can look down to what classes did you take to obtain that degree. Oftentimes we see people that had social work, people that had psychology, people that maybe had other human services things, education. Those oftentimes are common degrees that fit very well in human services. Some that maybe are a stretch that I've seen people struggle with in trying to show that it was human services is like a chemistry degree or architecture or things along those lines. And then for number 3, option number 3, that diploma from an accredited post-secondary institution, the language there really is around it's a set human service technician diploma that was issued, and this is probably going back to the 1990s or 1980s. It was a long time ago. It was not widely available, but those are some things to consider. And that is, if you had a different diploma maybe from one of these tech schools at that time that was human services related, it would be something that you could submit to DHS licensing for review to see if it meets the requirements. So, but great question.
How about 4 years degree in nursing?
4-year degree in nursing, yeah, nursing would absolutely meet the requirements of human services. Yep. All right, good. So then we're going to talk about the next position. And again, this can be the same person that holds both job titles, or maybe it's not a job title, but both job roles within the agency, and that's designated manager. So the designated coordinator, which we just talked about, is at the service delivery level, supervising maybe the direct care staff that are providing that support to the person, providing that employment support to the person. The designated manager oftentimes is one level up. They supervise that designated coordinator, and they're looking more across the board at all the whole program as a whole. What does quality assurance look like? What is our services overall looking like? What quality improvement things can be going on for our agency. So it's a little bit bigger picture, looking at the whole program as a whole, not just at the individual level. And so to qualify as that designated manager, they need to meet one of those previous ways of being a DC. So one of those 4 ways from the previous slide. And then they also need 3 years of supervisory experience in a program providing services to people with disabilities or people age 65 and older. So to meet that. So every organization needs to have a DC and a DM, and it could be the same person that meets both and does both functions. It could be maybe you have 10 DCs out there and 1 DM overseeing them. It can be structured any way. You could contract for that service out, or maybe it's a part-time staff. It really is based on how many people that you're supporting and serving, and how much oversight and support is needed around that. So those are the pieces around the designated coordinator and designated manager. So hopefully with all of the options there within your organization, you'd have someone that would meet those standards. So next, we're going to look at 245D and what are the training requirements that of that direct care staff that provide that support and service. So these training topics are everything that's required upon orientation within that first 60 days of a direct care staff working, and I use that term direct care staff. You might call them employment specialists, you might call them, I don't know what you might call them, but you might have all sorts of different job titles. But it's the people that are providing that direct contact, that direct care for that person or that support. So job description and functions and response to incidents, safety practices, policies and procedures, data privacy and Hipaa, both knowing Minnesota's requirements and the federal, knowing the people's rights that are receiving services, knowing the Maltreatment of Minors and Vulnerable Adult Act of recognizing maltreatment and what maltreatment looks like and reporting maltreatment, person-centered services and delivery. That's a big part of all of our services, is making sure that they're person-centered. First aid is required. And then if the person has in their service plan CPR being needed, then all staff that work with that, or one staff, excuse me, working with them should have CPR training. And then we have there the Cssp Addendum. That is, the Cssp is a document that case managers write. The Cssp Addendum is the document that the provider writes in response to the service needs, talking about what services will be delivered and how does that person want those services delivered, what supports do they need. So staff need to be trained on that. And then also people's outcomes. What are the, with intensive services, each person needs to have one outcome in place at least of what they're hoping to achieve with those services. Medication administration or setup, or if those responsibilities are assigned to the license holder. You also need to make sure your staff are trained in emergency use of manual restraint, if your agency allows that or if they don't allow that. A lot of these things maybe feel outside of the employment world because it may not be a need, but these standards are uniform for any 245D provider. Also prohibited procedures, covering what those are listed in 245D, but also in that positive supports rule I referenced earlier. There's an 8-hour training that is required, and that's around the positive supports rule core. And there's specific topics around, building a trusting relationship, how to help people when they're upset and angry, and how to help them de-escalate, what methods and approaches work well that are not invasive or intrusive, things like that. So that is the only topic that has a time limit around it, is that there is 8 hours for that brand new staff within 60 days of training. And that training has to happen. Some of these have to happen before the staff person is providing support. Anti-fraud, training on bloodborne pathogens and OSHA standards, minimizing the risk of sexual violence. That's a new topic, relatively new in the last year or so. Any other training that the Cssp has indicated, so maybe someone who uses sign language to communicate, then staff probably should be fluent in sign language or be trained in that way. It could be a topic that maybe the person has a diagnosis of autism and the case manager is asking that all staff that work with that person have some formal training around autism and understanding what that is. So some additions can be written in there. And then any specialized medical equipment, if it's your responsibility to support with that, you need to have training on that medical equipment. So those are the 245D requirements, all required within that 60 days of hire of your staff. And many of these topics are all repeated at least once a year, so that the differences are like job duty and job functions for staff. If that hasn't changed, that doesn't need to be done every year. The 8-hour positive supports role training, that can reduce to 4 hours for every year after that first year. So those are some of the training requirements. 245D also indicates that as an employment agency, you need to make sure staff meet the employment specialist competencies. And so I have a link there, that blue font is a link. You can click on that to go and read what those competencies are. You'd want to make sure that you're teaching staff to those measurements and then somehow assessing their competency and documenting that they're competent. So Yes, go ahead.
Oh, hi, Angie. This is Ryan. Jumping back in. I think you might have addressed it, but I see we have a question in the chat for how often is this training required for staff? So if you just want to jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Thank you so much for watching the chat for me. I'm horrible at that. Yes, so again, all these training requirements on this slide and the previous slide are required upon hire, some within 60 days, some before the person has contact and starts performing job duties, and that's all listed in 245D. And then all of these topics, aside from, I'm going to click back a slide here. So the job description and functions and policies and procedures, those don't need to be done every year. Those are only retrained if there's a change. But other things are required to be done every year. So training on rights, training on maltreatment of minors and Vulnerable Adult Act, training first aid if you're certified through a certification program. Oftentimes those certifications are 2 or 3 years long. Those are fine if it's a certification process and it doesn't have to be every year. But other pieces like the positive supports rule, the 8-hour is that first year of employment, and then the second and every year after that, it's a 4-hour requirement. But all of these topics here on this second slide here that I have up right now, those are done every year. And then the employment specialist competencies, usually once someone's competent, then they're competent and you shouldn't have to retrain on that. It's more about determining that the staff is competent to do those responsibilities. The thing is that if something happened and the staff was showing that they weren't doing a good job, maybe they're not helping anyone find a job, or they're not helping people learn about their skills and their strengths and their ability, then you might want to say, well, they're not competent. We need to provide more training. We need to help them if you see that there's a problem. So those are some of the training things. And again, the only time requirement is that positive supports rule core training, 8 hours that first year for staff, and then 4 hours every year after. The other things can be covered until the person's competent. So someone that's been in the field a long time and they know a lot about maltreatment, they know a lot about reporting, they might be able to take a test, do a review and take a test, and it only takes them 5 minutes because they're very knowledgeable about that information. All right. Some additional training that's required is, again, around that positive support rule, and that is management staff and supervisors need an additional 4-hour training on function-specific pieces for positive supports. And then owners, license holders, executive staff, people of that level need an additional 2 hours of function-specific. So that information can be found in that Minnesota Rule 9544. If you click on that rule, you can read through that and you can see what the training requirements are. So that's a little bit about what staff requirements are. Now we're going to shift our focus to look at, well, at the person that receives this employment support and services, what's required there. So this is kind of the bare minimum is that, there's an intake meeting, meeting with the person and their case manager oftentimes, and guardian if they have a guardian, and whatever other support team members that they want involved, to talk about services, talk about what that looks like, fill out a lot of paperwork, and start services. Then you're required to meet within 45 service days or 60 calendar days, whichever one comes sooner, to talk about how services are going, how are things going so far. So that does need to be a team meeting with the person, their legal representative, their case manager, and anyone else that they want at that meeting to talk about how services are going. And then from that point on, you can do an annual meeting as a very bare minimum for this service. Then some of the documentation is this other column that we have kind of off center a little bit. And that is you have to develop a Cssp Addendum, which is pretty involved. It's covering a lot of information. It could be one document or it could be many documents, but it's talking about service delivery and what the person's preferences are, how they want services delivered, by who, what their outcomes and goals are. All that is part of that Cssp Addendum. An individual abuse prevention plan is a document just to do an assessment to look at where might the person be vulnerable to abuse through, verbal abuse or sexual abuse or financial exploitation. Then what is the plan? How do we prevent that? How are we proactive to prevent those things from happening? The outcomes I kind of talked about, each person needs to have at least one outcome. And if it's an employment services, it's probably an employment related outcome. And it should be really specific to them, what they're looking for. If they want to learn more about what it looks like to be a dog groomer or whatever it might be, that could be their outcome. Or to sustain a job, if that's the outcome of that service, developing that outcome, having that in writing, and including the required information around that. And then finally, progress reports. And that's up to the person and their team, how often they want those reports on how outcomes are going or how other services are going. A lot of times people say, I just want that done annually at my annual meeting. Other people maybe want more frequent updates. So it could be monthly or quarterly or every 6 months. The variety can be all sorts. One piece I forgot to put on the slide, but that is 245D does require that the provider sit down with the person receiving services every 6 months and review how are the positive supports going and the services that the provider is providing. So positive supports strategies are positive things we do to help people, recognizing their strengths and their gifts and their talents and helping them instead of focusing on their areas of weaknesses or deficit. And how do we help people in a proactive way? Those are positive supports. And a lot of times we connect that to behaviors and bad behaviors, and it is to help reduce those in a positive, proactive way. And then the other 6-month meeting we have just with the person is to review how is the person-centered services? How are you as a provider doing at providing person-centered services? Hopefully you're listening to people, that, boy, they are not a morning person. So we're not trying to schedule 8 a.m. meetings with them all the time or dragging them out to go job hunting, when probably trying to find a job at a second shift would be a better fit, for who they are and what they're going to be very successful at in life. So having those person-centered services of knowing people well and delivering services that fit them best. All right. So that is a lot about licensing. 245D has a lot, as a provider that you're responsible for. So that information is all just around the 245D license. Once you have your 245D license, then you can apply for enrollment, or you can go through the enrollment process with DHS. And the link is on the bottom of this slide. And it will bring you to this great webpage that DHS has on HCBS enrollment. And this is to enroll, to be able to bill for services and to meet the enrollment requirements. So this part, there are a number of forms that need to be filled out. The enrollment forms I have right at this link at the top to click through. And there's 2 options of how you go about doing this. You can, and what we actually recommend, people seem to keep everything a little bit better organized by going through the forms, pulling them all out, filling them out, getting them all organized, because there is probably between 10 and 14 forms that need to be submitted, and making sure you have them done correctly, and then faxing them into DHS enrollment. And you want to do this after you have your 245D license, because you'll want to show that you have that 245D license to be eligible to enroll as an employment service provider. The other option, and this is a little bit newer, is that there is a provider screening and enrollment portal that allows you to go online and fill out all the information and do that electronically. One just thing about that is because so many things still require signatures and different documents still need to be uploaded, you end up filling out a lot of the same forms, either on your computer, printing them out and then uploading them again, or so oftentimes we see greater success with people if they just fax everything in together in one lump. But the portal is an option, and the portal is great. Once you are enrolled, you're able to go in and look and see what services you're enrolled to provide, what you're eligible for, and all of those pieces. The enrollment cost is $599. You also need to have that general liability insurance certificate as part of an enrolled provider. So that is the enrollment process. trying to think if I feel like I've talked really fast and a lot, but hopefully this gave you a high level overview with enough details and information to help you, know what the requirements are, know what will be expected, and be able to make those decisions of getting a 245D license and doing enrollment. So some resources, we're kind of ending the end of our breakout session, but again, the slide was up earlier. Again, resources on upcoming webinars are available. Looks like on April 27th and 29th and May 4th. The coffee chats are coming up as well. That's a great place for questions to be answered, and to have more information presented with lingering questions you might have. And again, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on that site, as well as frequently asked questions. Some of the information will be provided there too. Ryan, is there anything else that either popped in the chat or that you wanted to add?
No, Angie, I was just putting on my video to come in and add some of this information, but you got it right as I went out. So no, I think that's good. We're at 3:23 my mind, so we just got a couple more minutes if we need it. But otherwise, I think we've addressed all the questions that came up in the chat. So thanks for giving that a lot of information and really great overview. Thanks for providing that.
Good. Well, you're welcome. So glad to have so many of you in. I'll kind of keep an eye now on the chat. I haven't at all. Oh, there's a question that came in about what is the differences between CDCS waiver and 245D. So the CDCS is a self-directed option where those services are not licensed. The person is having people come into their home for services to provide support there. The 245D, though, to provide employment services, that is a licensed service to provide employment. So if and Ryan, I might have to look to you. If a person is receiving CDCS funding and they want to purchase or buy employment services, that provider would need to then be 245D licensed.
Yeah, this is a great, there's some important policy clarification here. So for like the final answer, this would be a good one to send into one of like our inboxes at DHS. But I think, you addressed it. CDCS is an option for people who are receiving waiver services to help self-direct their waiver services. So if I'm receiving waiver supports as Ryan, and I want to be able to self-direct those supports and kind of like choose things myself and get a budget and be able to work within that budget. CDCS, or Community Directed Consumer Supports, I think is what the acronym stands for, is an option that people can use to self-direct those supports. And when they're self-directing, people can, they're not like confined to the traditional waiver services. They can do other things. But I think, and this is where, don't quote me here, this is where it would be really important to clarify with that policy staff is if you are going to choose, if that person is choosing like a traditional waiver service, like employment exploration services, then I believe that a provider delivering that would have to meet the license, would have to meet the standards for licensing and stuff. But CDCS is just it's another service option for people.
Thanks, Ryan. I see another question came in, and the question is the two different payments, initial payment and enrollment. And I think the question might be around the 245D license application fee of $500. That's one payment. Yep, so that's one payment. And then after that, and when you're ready for the enrollment process, then it's a separate payment of $599 for the enrollment application. Yeah, so it is two different payments that are required. I'm just scrolling. I think we probably hit all the questions.
Yeah, I think that's great. And we could certainly get out a couple minutes early, just respect everyone's time. I know they're, hopping between meetings now. So yeah. Let's see. We locate the rates. Oh, that's a great, I'm going to turn that to you, Ryan. Yeah, we have rate setting frameworks. So let me see if I can get that link into the chat, but basically we have disability waiver rate setting frameworks, and they vary by service. So in the chat, Eric, I will put in a hyperlink to those, and you can check out if you're interested. If you go to that link, there's a 2021 Employment Services spreadsheet. And basically, if you pull it up, you fill out some things like what area are you serving, and you know, what the staffing ratios are, and it'll help you calculate what the 15-minute unit rate for that employment service would be.
Great. Well, thank you all for attending and joining our breakout session. And again, if you wanted to catch the other side of things that will be posted for the VRS and the SSB part will be posted on that website. So you can go back and watch that breakout session if you want that information as well. But thank you all so very much. We appreciate you all.
Thanks, everyone.